we are waiting for Eleanor to join, but in the meantime, what I thought I could do is I could get us started. We'll run through some introductions, and then hopefully by that point, Eleanor will be here and she can introduce herself as well. So thank you all for coming along. What this is in response to the government's release of the white paper on education reform. The team here at SEN have gone through it, tried to understand it as best as we can. And today's session is about helping you to understand our sort of overview of that and our understanding of it. And we've put a panel together who I'll have introduce themselves, but we put a panel together so as we can truly capture as many sort of families' voices in the response to this, so as we can truly understand what this means for you and for future generations as well. So that's going to be our plan of today. My name is Richard. I'm the Chief Exec of SOS SEN. I don't have a SEND law background, so my aim today is to sort of act as chairperson, quizmaster, question master, and throw the questions to the panel and try to get a real understanding of where we're at. We've got a number of topics that we're going to cover. The chat function should be open. Feel free to add some questions in there, but please bear in mind we're going to cover a lot of ground today, and we're going to see if we can get that done in the 90 minutes. So we may not be able to get to all of those questions, but we might be answering them across the section. We've tried as best as we can to think of as many different topics as we possibly can. So that's an introduction from myself. If I head to yourself, Annie.
Hi, I'm Annie. I am the volunteer coordinator at SOS SEN, and so part of my role is supporting volunteers, but I actually came to SOS SEN as a parent and became a volunteer in 2023. I have a child who is in primary mainstream with an EHCP.
Excellent, thank you. Sam, I'll come to yourself next.
Hi everyone, I'm Sam. I'm one of the SEN advisors here at SOS SEN, but today I'm joining you to give a parental perspective of specialist settings. So I've got two children who both started out at mainstream, who are both now at specialist settings and thriving there actually, both for very different reasons. Thanks, Richard.
Excellent, thank you. Megan?
Hello, I've been a SEN volunteer for 9 years now, I think. I also have 3 kids who are all neurodivergent. I'm also a teacher by profession, and still kind of have links into schools. 2 of my kids are currently in specialist, all started in mainstream. 2 are currently in specialist. 1 has just returned after 6 years on IOTUS, much to everyone's surprise. Both are doing really well, and a 3rd is still on IOTUS and will remain there.
Lovely, thank you, Megan. And Eleanor?
Hi, I'm legal officer with SOS SEN. That's basically it.
I think it's worth noting that your many years of sort of education law expertise and the many sort of panels that you sit on to advise and support as well. So yes, so that is us, that is the panel. We are hoping that from those introductions you've seen, we're going to cover quite a wide array of experience and knowledge in today's session. The way that we're going to do this is we wanted to start things off by Eleanor will do a presentation, give us a presentation on the white paper itself and give us an overview of the white paper, so as you can understand sort of the finer points of that and our understanding. Then we are going to talk into sort of more detail on what we understand about from early years right up to post 16, and then we're going to go into some other areas that we'll kind of delve into some of those details there. So I'm going to hand over to Eleanor to present on the general overview of the white paper before we sort of open up to the panel.
Okay, I've got some slides which I hope will come up. This is just going to be a really quick summary. I'm not going to sort of comment about things. It's basically to give you a quick overview, but it's a long document which is worth reading. But before going into this, what I really want to emphasize is that none of this is in force yet, and according to the government won't really start taking effect until September 2030. So if you are being told by your local authority now, sorry, that they have to change things because of the law, that is not true. So what is being proposed under the new system is that there will be 4 levels which are set out there. There's the universal offer, which is more or less what's available in schools anyway to cover most children. Then targeted support, which is what's available in school for children most commonly occurring needs that can't be met by the universal, i.e. by normally available just day to day. So that would include things like small group work and so on. Then there's Targeted Plus, which is the school providing the support with input from education and health professionals. And it's suggested that schools could group with each other to deliver this. Sorry, frog in my throat. Might include access to inclusion base or going into a specialist setting, alternative provision. And then above that is specialist support for children with the most complex needs, and that would ultimately go into an EHCP. And for the last 3 categories, every child will have a digital individual support plan, which is drawn up in collaboration with parents, and schools will have a statutory duty to draw that up and to deliver on it. So the universal offer is meant to include there's an inclusive system for everybody, a lot of emphasis on inclusion with high quality teaching, and to help that they're proposing basically to put funding in for various improvements like teacher training, high quality, better leadership and governance, and so on. There will be national inclusion standards, which are still being formulated and which will no doubt take some time to be formulated by experts. We don't know who the experts are, and they would be reviewed 2 years in relation to targeted provision, every 5 years for special provision. And the idea is it set clear guidance for what should be the universal offer, and as part of that they would update the code of practice. In fact, the entire law will have to be updated, really. Then early provision and support. There's a lot of emphasis here on the fact that it is best, obviously, for problems to be detected early and to be provided for early. So there's a lot of emphasis on that. They're going to put funding in for Best Start family hubs and for everybody involved in looking after young children to have improved training so they can understand, detect, meet needs from the earliest point possible, and funding for strengthened transition between the early year settings and schools, and also fast track assessments for EHCPs for under 5s with very complex conditions. There would be a statutory duty for these individual support plans to be kept up to date, so every setting is recording and monitoring each child's SEN and provision. They be produced by the school or whatever and the parents together. These should be reviewed at least yearly, and the content of them, from what is quite similar to a current EHCP, and there'd be a description of the provision to meet needs and outcomes. But the difference is that it's the school's duty to provide it rather than the local authorities. For specialist support, I've said this is for children with complex needs, and that will be defined by reference to 7 specialist provision packages, which are still being worked on. And the process will be similar to what we have now. The needs would be assessed. There'll be a decision whether SPP is needed. If so, which package. This is where it changes. They would then, first of all, they decide the package, then the placement, and only then would they do the EHCP. So the EHCP comes last, after they've decided on the package and after they've decided on the placement. So basically they will be offering you a choice of placements that can offer that package. You can nominate other placements. Local authority has to provide the funding and support to make SPPs happen. Schools still have to provide the ISPs even with an EHCP. SPPs are only to be reviewed at phase transfer stages, which is significant because presumably that will be the only time when you have a right to appeal after an annual review. And they will continue to have health and social care elements, but I have to say proposals get very vague around these, and there are quite a lot of indicators of provision being pushed to health in particular. So you still have a right, when it comes to a placement for a child with an EHCP, you would still have a right to express a preference. Still doesn't mean you get it. Although there's the idea is, particularly if you want mainstream, the local authority should normally meet your preference. I talked about the list of recommended settings, and another big change when they're deciding about the placement, local authorities can take into account the effectiveness of the provision and value for money, including whether, if they agree to this one high cost placement, would that impact on their finances so that they would then struggle to meet the needs of other children in the area. So it might be that, this school can meet your child's needs, they can't find another, but they could still say no because basically they couldn't afford it. Back to the specialist provision packages, they are to be again drawn up by this national panel of experts. They should set out the interventions, resources and the standards required to support children and young people with the most complex needs. Some of them might be solely for mainstream schools. That will be all that we will be offered. And they will be reviewed every 5 years. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but it's basically a list of what the packages are. You'll have access to these slides afterwards, so you can go through them. But you'll see it's sort of, you've got on the complex, on this end, there's the complex and significant severe needs, profound and multiple needs. They're quite widely phrased and cover quite a lot of variations. You've then got some for adapted delivery of the curriculum, including behaviour, and they sort of divide that up between challenging behaviour and internalising behaviour. So they're thinking about things like, I suspect, selective mutism and so on for that last one. And then finally, what they describe as packages to enable access to the curriculum. So things like sensory impairment, which they mostly define as deafness, visual impairment and multisensory, and physical disabilities. And those are the ones particularly where they might only list mainstream schools. And the idea is that your child has to fit into one of those packages. Not, you can't sort of pick and choose from them. Quite a lot of emphasis on support bases, which are similar to the current units and so on, and resource bases that some schools have. So there'll be 2 types. There'll be the support base and the specialist base, or the inclusion base. The support base is one that's simply really set up by the school, funded by them to deliver targeted support. And the specialist space is commissioned and funded by the local authority to deliver specialist support. And that will probably be particular types of support. So you will have say, one unit that's for dyslexia, one unit that's for speech and language, and so on. And a specialist space could include both children with an EHCP and children on Targeted Plus. And the idea is that over time, every single secondary school will have an inclusion base, that specialist one, and indeed a lot of certainly the biggest primaries. Another innovation is this idea of experts at hand. They're going to put a lot of funding into recruiting more educational psychologists and speech and language therapists in particular. The idea is each school will have access to them, mostly to help with designing and implementing all their SEN provision strategies and training and so on. But they might also work with individual children under EHCPs. The idea is meant to be quite a bit of what we they're suggesting there would be 40 days a year available for mainstream primaries, 160 days a year for secondary. Again, that might vary according to size, but the big question is actually finding the people to invest in. And they're also suggesting that special schools will do much more by way of outreach support for other local schools. Accountability and dispute resolution is sort of the big one. As I mentioned earlier, the idea is that it's the school that has the statutory duties. So they've got the duty to make sure children receive high quality and effective support, and also to set up these ISPs. So that's a statutory duty, which is emphasised as being stronger than it is now. However, there isn't any inbuilt enforcement mechanism as such. Ofsted has now widened its remit, so it's supposed to look out for inclusion, and it will check on it, including checking on specialist and support bases. The other sort of accountability, in theory, is through schools' complaints procedures. And the idea is that they will include all complaints about SEND, including everything to do with ISPs and which level of support your child is on, and should your child be in a support base. So currently, those are normally complaints procedures normally involve going up a ladder through the head teacher to a panel of governors. So I assume that will still be the case, but they are saying that panels would also include an independent SENS specialist, and they suggest that might be someone from a SENCO, like a SENCO from another school, or a senior teacher from another school with SEN responsibility. And Ofsted will keep an eye on complaints data, but the complaints panels won't have any power to enforce their decisions if the school doesn't choose to follow it. So it looks like you would still have to go to things like disability discrimination appeals and things like courts, judicial review. So for appeals themselves, mediation is to be strengthened. Not sure how. For tribunal appeal, you will be able to appeal against a refusal of assessment or decision that a child hasn't met the criteria for an SPP, or it is a decision to cease an EHCP, or the type of package, including the placement. As I mentioned earlier, fewer annual reviews, so you won't have those post-annual review, so many opportunities to appeal after an annual review. Presumably you would have a right to appeal after an amendment. Still, the big change is if you're appealing against the placement, the only part the tribunal has is to decide, was the local authority decision on that placement reasonable? And even if it decides it is unreasonable, it can't order a different placement. It will have to go back to the local authority to decide again. And again, they haven't said what should happen to that child's education in the meantime. The transition process, it's not happening immediately. They will start investing in some of it, start putting some of the training in place more or less this year, and start working on things like inclusion standards. But the rest of it, as I said earlier, not happening until 2030. So that's a bit of a breathless rundown, and we will start talking about that in much more detail right now.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Eleanor. It's really helpful to have like the overview of the white paper before we start sort of delving into it. What I think would be really good to sort of delve into is, from our understanding of the white paper, it's asking the question of what do we know now in the different sort of sections. So we're going to look at early years, mainstream, specialist, AOTUS, and post 16 to 25. So if I go to yourself first, Eleanor, what's your view on what this means for early years?
Well, the early years, I will say, is one of the good parts of this. It makes so much sense for everyone to be reminded that they should be looking at possible special needs from an early stage, and currently that doesn't happen enough. In fact, there tends to be an assumption that you throw every child into reception and let the primary school sort it out. And so that would be really helpful, as will sort of fast tracking EHCPs for the under fives for similar reasons. The proof again is in the pudding, and I think people generally regarded Sure Start, the previous Sure Start, as quite helpful and regretted it's going. So having, as it were, Mark II should be helpful. But it will very much depend on, is the funding there, is the training there, is it kept up? And there's a degree of changing mindsets, because, as I say, what we come across quite often is this thing of, well, almost people being in denial, and, well, they're just a little bit immature, really looking out for difficulties.
Lovely. Megan would like to comment on this.
Question actually for Eleanor. I have to confess that the early years bit is not the bit that I've kind of focused my reading on. With this, for those people who have children within private nurseries, private EYFs, and they stay there until they go to reception, are there and can there be duties on those private nurseries to do the same stuff around early identification?
I think potentially they could be, because they have to be registered, and they have to meet other requirements, obviously, like safeguarding, so on. So I would have thought the potential is there to insist that they have some sort of capacity to. They have gone through the training and will be looking out for SEN and know where to refer on to and access support and so on.
Okay, thank you.
Annie, we'll come to you.
There was some information in the white paper about childminders also being included in the training, and so I think it is going to be a sort of universal, or being able to be universally accessed.
Thank you. Annie, I'll come on to yourself now to ask about mainstream.
Yeah, so mainstream's an interesting one, I think, because obviously I have a child in mainstream with an EHCP, and so there's obviously a lot of concern about the fact that he won't qualify for an EHCP in the new system. My concerns are all around what that will look like for him, in terms of whether he will get enough support, firstly under the universal support system, and whether then, if the targeted or targeted plus is enough to be able to make sure that he can progress in mainstream education. There is also discussion within the white paper about children moving between different levels of support, and so where they start off with universal support and then potentially move into targeted support for a period of time, and then move back to universal support again. once whatever intervention has been delivered, and then they're deemed to be able to access standard learning again. And then in addition to that, whether the school's duty to provide reasonable adjustments will be enough to be able to support children like mine who are academically able but are socially unable, and you know, all of the things that he needs just to support his day, whether they will still be in place for him or not. And due to the fact that he's currently in primary, he has quite a lot of one-to-one support. He does small group interventions. He also has pet therapy. So he has quite a lot built into his day at the moment. And so my concern would be, actually, can universal support be enough to be able to make sure that he continues to progress in the way that he is?
Is there a concern here? The language that you're using is the language that we're seeing. Is there a concern here that when we are saying that mainstream schools need to make reasonable adjustments, isn't that almost, going back to the weasel words, isn't it a bit of woolly language that actually a school could say it's not reasonable for us to be able to do that? We don't have the funding to be able to do that. So does that then play into the risks of where we're at with that?
Well, I think maybe that's one for Eleanor, but certainly in terms of disability discrimination, that is going to be one of the routes of redress for families like mine who potentially have children who are being discriminated against in school because reasonable adjustments are not being put in place. But as you say, a defence against that is that it's not reasonable for the school to be able to make that adjustment. So there is certainly difficulties around that, and whether the school's complaints system is going to be suitable to be able to manage putting things right for children, and whether that can be done quickly enough. I mean, I certainly know that our school's complaint system is a 3-stage system, and I know of a parent who is currently in that system, and so far it's taken about 2.5 terms for her to be going through the stages of that system. So it seems that that's probably not going to be quicker than going to tribunal as it stands at the moment.
Megan, you had something here?
Yeah, I mean, there are some good bits, and I think the bringing in of targeted and targeted plus is a good thing, and bringing that in within the statutory system. I mean, for those of us that were around pre-2014, it very much does remind us quite significantly of School Action and School Action Plus. And at that point in time, it was a legal duty on schools to have a SEND register and have children on it. And it was very much a failing of the 2014 reforms that so little time in the SEND Code of Practice was spent addressing what should happen before a new HCP was put into place. So I think bringing that back into the system is a good thing, notwithstanding the difficulties with how they've decided to bring that in and what sits around that.
Okay, thank you. Eleanor?
Yeah, I just had a slightly different view on Targeted Plus. My concern is that there'll be no need for any sort of assessment before a child goes on to Targeted Plus, which is put forward as one of the advantages of this. And yeah, yes, it's going to be quicker to get that support. The problem is if a school is investing quite a lot of money in supporting a child without having a full picture of what their needs are, because we do see cases far too often when the school is really unaware of things like masking or sensory needs. So, if they're putting money into, say, one-to-one support, when what that child actually needs is some quite targeted sensory occupational therapy, then they're wasting money and they're not necessarily helping that child.
Right. Back to Annie.
Yeah, based on what Eleanor was saying, it also occurs that in terms of like inclusion bases, sort of how inclusive is an inclusion base when you're removing children from mainstream education to access them. So that one of the things that my child struggles with is being different. And so what you're creating is a difference. So although he needs the support, if he has to leave mainstream classroom to be able to access that support, that is going to make him feel fundamentally different to his peers. So I guess that you know, in terms, and also in terms of funding, and I think that's also quite a significant part of the white paper, is they're supporting the capital funding of these inclusion bases, but there doesn't seem to be any funding in terms of what goes into one. So the school has to be able to provide, if it's sensory equipment or whatever else it is, that's got to come out of their mainstream funds, rather than that being actually funded upfront as part of the changes in the white paper.
Okay, thank you. Megan, I'll come to you, but I'm conscious of time on this, so I'll come to yourself.
I mean, just to Annie's point there, not just sensory stuff, but actually how do they staff these resource bases is not accounted for in terms of funding. And I think I did warn everybody that I would stand on this soapbox briefly, but there is no evidence to support the use of resource bases, and yet the government has talked heavily about them being you know, using evidence-based provision and evidence-based input. We don't have evidence to support that how these bases work, what they should look like, how that works. And I think one of the conversations we've all had is, you know, one of the supposed plus sizes of the reform is that your kids with SEN can go to their local school and the school where their siblings go to. Yet these inclusion bases are due to have their own little specialisms. So what if your child's needs are not met at the inclusion base in your local school, but instead they have to go across the borough? How is that different to the system that we have now? So I think for me, there is a real ideological belief from the Department for Education that inclusion bases are the answer, are the solution to the problem, and I think it's really unevidenced and short-sighted.
Thank you. Sam, let's hear from yourself on specialist. What does the white paper mean for specialist provisions?
So obviously, all children who are at a specialist setting have an EHCP, apart from a very small minority who are waiting for the assessment process. So it's going to be down to which package they fit into, and as to whether the provision in that package actually can be met in a mainstream, and if so, that's where the child's going to go. They've indicated there's a massive increase in children with EHCPs, and the only unchanging needs are against profound and multiple learning disabilities and severe learning difficulties. So there's been no increase in those two categories of need, and they've indicated that those two needs are the most likely to require specialist school places. So from the white paper, it indicates that they are going to remain the same, and they will be the type of children at the specialist settings. My child has quite complex needs. She's got both physical and cognitive needs, but these are not profound or severe. They're just moderate needs. She doesn't actually fit into one of these packages. So that indicates to me that she may not have a specialist school setting when it comes to her phase transfer move, which is really, really concerning. The reason I moved her was that there was such a such a massive gap between her and her peers, that she didn't have a friendship group, she didn't have any peer interactions. All the work was differentiated with one-to-one support. But because of that, because of those factors, she wasn't actually included in the mainstream setting. So it was my choice to move her to specialist. She now has a peer group. She now has friendships. I've got, you know, she can interact with those peers. They have similar interests, similar needs, and she's thriving there. And I wouldn't want her to go back into a mainstream setting and to be back in that same situation.
Yeah, that strikes me as quite a bizarre level of decisions based on sort of where your child's at, and all the things that you've just laid out there sound very sensible, logical decisions. And now there is the peer group and the support. It seems illogical to now uproot her
So
and
they're
change that.
saying that they won't ask anybody to leave specialist setting. But obviously, they're going to review those EHCPs at phase transfer. So if your child is at primary and they're going to move into secondary, there will be that question as to what support is right for your child's needs, but they're going to be trying to fit them into one of these 7 specialist provision packages.
Yeah.
And children do not fit in these packages. They're trying to put them into a box that is provision-led based on their needs.
And it's as you say, they're being incredibly careful with their language. They're not going to ask anyone to move. That doesn't mean that they're not going to tell people that you're going to move, which is really concerning. Annie?
Yeah, I was just going to say that in terms of the sort of mainstream provision, they were talking about utilising specialist schools to allow children to go for a limited period of time into specialist so that they can be enabled to move back to mainstream schools. And I wonder whether part of the concern, Sam, is going to be around whether just because they're in specialist for the time being, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to remain there if they feel that they can support them enough to be able to move them into mainstream settings.
That also raises concern with regards to sort of consistency, doesn't it? And where will this end? How long am I in this placement versus that placement? Who decides that my time here is now done? That raises an awful lot of uncertainty, and I think for children and young people, that's when education becomes particularly scary, doesn't it?
Well, and particularly for children who struggle with the transitions.
Yeah. Megan?
And I think this is a massive failing of the reforms. Is it's hugely regressive. It's gone very much back to the medical model of disability, and it seems to totally ignore the social model of disability. The disability rests, and the deficits rest solely within the child, and there's a complete ignoring of the fact that environment is so important. And I can't see in there in the writing of it that unless an autistic person or a neurodivergent person has learning difficulties or perhaps some quite extreme behaviour, I can't see that they're looking for them to be in a specialist school. And yet so many of us out there will know that environment is key in a smaller environment. That a mainstream secondary particularly is simply the sizes that they currently are and the way that they operate isn't able to meet the needs of our child, even if the curriculum's adapted, even if even if there's a resource base that they can go to for some of their time.
Thank you. Okay, Eleanor, if I come to yourself for post 16 and onwards, what's the sort of outcome from the white paper on this?
Well, it appears that it will still be the case. You can have an EHCP up to the age of 25. I think we would all have quite a lot of worries about the practicality of that, because it will then presumably for a lot of young people become the responsibility of people like further education colleges to draw up ISPs and make sure that they happen, and sort of and question, do they have access to experts at hand in the same way as schools, and what sort of funding do they have? I think the significant issue particularly is, of course, the number of young people who who end up out of education for various reasons, that perhaps they're on EOTIS, perhaps a placement has broken down, perhaps if they're doing something like an apprenticeship, there may be relatively little involvement by somebody like a college. And the older they get, the more complex it's going to be, I suspect, I strongly suspect the number of EHCPs will fall. The other aspect is, as I mentioned earlier, that there appears to be a move to put a lot of provision towards health, and post 16, I'm sure it would also be moving more towards social services. I mean, we see it now to an extent. Local authority is trying to say it's down to social services to do preparation for adulthood. And I can see that happening more in the future as well. But I'm afraid with an awful lot of these, I'm looking at some of the questions in chat, and the answer is so much we don't know yet, because although it's a long white paper, it's still quite short on detail, and we're going to have to wait for the amendments to the Act to come out.
Yeah, thank you. Annie?
Yeah, one of the things that stood out to me in the post-16 side of things was that so colleges are funded for children or young people to remain until age 19. But beyond that, unless they have an EHCP, they're not going to have that funding. So for those that are on ISPs, it looks to me like their education will end at 19 rather than being able to go on to 25. So that's going to be quite a change, I think, in the post-16 arena.
Okay. So it sounds, from my limited knowledge, it sounds like there's going to be a lot of added pressure on other services that are already under enormous strain. And largely this will come back full circle to saving money and how quickly can we do these things, not how well can we do these things, which raises quite a lot of concerns. Megan, I'm going to come to yourself now to see how the white paper addresses AOTUS.
It doesn't. It is absent from the white paper entirely. And after reading and rereading it, because obviously this is a particular area of interest of mine, I'm afraid I can't help but be of the opinion that it is absent by design, not by error. I think that there is an intention to try and not have it. PBs are also not in the white paper, so personal budgets. And again, I mean, that's an incredibly misunderstood area of the system at the moment by everybody, but they're not there either. AP, alternative provision, still does exist, and they split it into two groups. So they have school-based APs, so I'm presuming that they mean things like PRUs, and then they talk about unregistered APs. AP schools will be very similar to specialist schools in that they will provide outreach, they'll provide short-term placements, and those are specifically designated for social and emotional needs, but also for needs to be identified and resolved so that children can go back into mainstream. And where they talk about longer term placements in AP schools, I think it's interesting. I think they see that as being mainly for older kids, but the language they use around this is quite interesting. So that they're to support pupils to move into more sustainable placements, with a particular emphasis on post-16 and employment. So it seems to me that they think that will be older children, those in Key Stage 4 headed into that. For unregistered APs, they're talking about registering them effectively and them having to follow national standards, which I don't think is a bad thing. I do think that we need some regulation around APs. However, again, I think the national standards will make clear that these APs are going to have to focus on short-term interventions. And they also state that students will need to be on roll at a school whilst accessing these. Which again makes me think that this concept of not being on roll somewhere is going. And overall, they look at AP as the emphasis being keeping kids in mainstream. That's going to be the emphasis. I have looked at the Welsh system, and AOTUS does exist in the Welsh system, but that gave me hope initially because it's there under the same principles when it's inappropriate for the special educational provision to be delivered in a school. But that law was brought in 2018, and that was prior to the explosion of AOTUS post-COVID. And I can't help but think that they aren't going to do that this time round, which leaves me thinking that there are only real place, because obviously with the Children Wellbeings and Schools Bill, the ability to even home ed is going to be curtailed somewhat, will be that the Section 19 duties. So under the Education Act 1996, the duty to deliver education other than at school if children can't attend by reason of ill health or otherwise. But I think my fear there is that there will be new guidance on how you define ill health and the level of evidence that you might need in order to determine that that's a thing. I sound cynical and slightly depressed, and I am, if I'm honest. I mean, I must say, I'm looking at my youngest, who's about to go into year 7 in September and has IOTA agreed. I don't think post 16, when we look at this, it will, when she'll be up for assessment for an EHCP, I don't think she'll get one. And should my other need to return, if it's not soon, I think, yeah. But there will be a pushback on this massively, and I think it's incredibly short-sighted, and I think it simply denies the reality. These children are not suddenly going to magically be able to walk into a school. It's simply not the case. And putting in early support for some of these kids is not going to eradicate the problem. That for some of these kids, school is just not going to work, or certainly not mainstream. So where I am hopeful is that they're going to have to listen, because they can't just magic it away. They can't magic away the problem.
Am I right in thinking, though, at present there are children and young people that are struggling to attend school, and in those instances, the local authorities are then implementing fines for the families for those children not attending until these packages are sorted. Am I kind of on the right sort of pathway there?
Not yes, no. Yes, families are getting fined where there are problems of attendance. I think if you're on the pathway to a package, then it's everyone's recognizing that there are needs that need to be met and provision that needs to be delivered in another way. It's for those who aren't kind of within that pathway, where fines are being delivered, where perhaps schools see it as a parenting issue or a behavioural issue, or those sorts of things. And so there are a huge swathe of kids who, I have no doubt that for almost any child that's not in school, it's unmet needs as opposed to can't be asked itis.
So if AOTUS is taken away, if that pathway is taken away, does that then bring in more risk for those parents to come under fire for not taking their child to a school?
Yes, without a doubt.
Okay.
I'm afraid is the short answer there.
No, that's what I anticipated.
The answer is attendance. And I get it. I used to deliver the attendance assemblies telling students, for every day of absence, your grade will drop, and believe it. Until my children taught me a very, a very important lesson, and made me understand things from a different perspective. But government is absolutely clear that school is best.
Okay, so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to move us on to our next topic, the targeted support framework. And I just wanted us to sort of spend a little bit of time talking about what targeted plus, ISPs, inclusion hubs, just our sort of overview of these. So would anyone like to come in first on sort of this plan? Eleanor,
I was expecting Eleanor to jump in.
Yeah, I was too.
I'll jump in on her behalf. So I think we probably have touched on this already, but it's I think the biggest concern around this at the moment is, I mean, the experts at hand sounds brilliant, and I think Eleanor has said before that she's a quite a fan of the idea that there will be experts available to schools, and I have to agree that that is a positive, because at the moment they're a bit like hen's teeth. So I think that that can only be a positive thing for children being educated in mainstream. My concern is much more around the exclusion of children into inclusion hubs, and that's where most of my concern lies. I also wonder, and maybe some of the others will pitch in, around how children are going to be given a mainstream education alongside all of the other interventions that are going to be done outside of mainstream. So the likelihood is that they're not going to necessarily manage 9 GCSEs when they also have other interventions going on in the background. Megan, I'll hand over to you because I know you have an opinion on that.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And I think one of the reasons where mainstream schools currently get to the point where they feel able to evidence that the child's needs can no longer be met in mainstream are when we're withdrawing children to such an extent that actually, they're not getting access to a teacher, they're not getting access to a peer group, they're spending more time either out of the classroom or solely with a one-to-one. I think it speaks to Sam's point earlier. When my son, who is currently, I think, sitting 8 GCSEs and will likely get, really good grades and go to uni, when he was in primary, we all agreed, let's keep him in mainstream. But his friends were his TAs. He didn't have a peer group, and since moving to specialist, my eyes were really opened in that he's suddenly got a peer group, and when your friend is the TA, they're always making social, and communication allowances for you. They're the adult, they're the one kind of managing, the communication, and actually so much learning takes place within that natural peer group where your peers don't make those allowances, and you have to learn to put up with people being annoying and people not doing what you say, and having their own opinions. And that's vital skills that's going to see you on into adulthood. You're not going to, if you go into adulthood thinking everyone's going to always make allowances for you and your differences, you're not going to succeed in the workplace. So again, I think not providing these children with a proper peer group, people that they can be friends with and spar with, this is not inclusion.
Eleanor?
It's partly on the experts at hand thing. I mean, yes, again, with the big caveat, if it happens, it's a plus, because schools now currently really struggle to access, everybody struggles to access ed psychs and speech and language therapists. But it depends on adequate funding, and they talk quite optimistically about being able to get the extras by enticing people back from retirement and private practice. I suspect they may be lucky, but who knows? But there's a point somebody actually sort of flagged up in chat, and very valid one, that doesn't actually mean that these skills will end up being watered down, because they also talk about, well, we'll be making more use of trainees. And there does tend to be that in general, I find, with government policy, that if they want to save money, they do it by dumbing down, and by going to more unqualified people to do work which really ought to be left to qualified people. There's also silences. It's only those two that they talk about. I would hope it must include people like physios and occupational therapists. The big silences around mental health. There's no mention of psychiatrists and clinical psychologists, although that's an increasing problem. They talk about mental health teams going into schools, but that's something quite different, and that's where it is needed most. The other aspect actually is that part of this is aimed to save money on transport, and as I think Sam was talking about earlier, if the reality is that, if the dyslexia provisions in the west of the country and the speech and language provision is in the east, then children in the wrong sector are still going to be crossing over, and there's still going to be big transport bills. So questionable, really, how helpful that is. If it's also, it's how helpful it is. Each unit will be fairly small. It'll be covering the entire age range from 11 till 16. So what sort of peer group do the children have? Still exclusion in practice. So that's not necessarily the panacea that's being suggested.
Megan?
Just going back to Eleanor's point there about mental health, I think this is one of the things that worries me the most. The category social, emotional, and mental health, it's notable that mental health is being removed from that title and it is just social and emotional. And it's quite clear that mental health is being moved back to health to deliver. Eleanor talks of the mental health teams, and I've looked into them, and they essentially deliver short-term CBT. That's their remit, which we know for so many of our kids is simply not appropriate. And again, I've got visions of them rocking up to a neurodivergent young person or a young person with ME and kind of trying to give them CBT to deal with their thought processes, so that because it's their thought processes that are the problem as to why they can't attend the school. And it's just such a harmful narrative. But within this white paper, there is nothing about extra funding for CAMS at all. Yet it seems to me that they want to take this and place it over there. And people in the chat have sort of commented upon that actually this is part of a wider approach from the government. And certainly when you look at the narrative around overdiagnosis, of the narrative around too many people on PIP, people with mental health problems that should be working, this does seem to fit into that wider narrative that's kind of like, no, too many people see themselves as disabled. And really we need to pull our socks up and crack on. And this feels like part of that as well to me.
It's quite concerning because obviously we know that nationally there is a mental health crisis going on, and there is a huge lack of resource available to support people with any form of mental health. So it feels almost backward to take this provision away when you could make a difference and add more pressure onto other services already. Again, sadly, I'm coming from a cynical place, but it just doesn't feel like there's been long-term thinking here on the impact across the board, and they're not talking about it, which means that for me, it feels like they're neglecting it.
It's missing the whole point, I think. So many of us with children who have had mental health difficulties will know the mental health difficulties stem from the unmet needs and the wrong environment, not from the diagnoses that they have, or being an inherent part of that diagnosis. And actually, my lived experiences demonstrate that if we can get that right quickly, we can actually, heal the mental health problem, whereas it was when we can see the evidence that when we don't, these young people then become young adults who leave school with no qualifications, whose mental health is absolutely shot, who require significant health input, significant social care input, and can't work. And therefore are on PIP. They're not contributing to the economy, even if we look at it at the most base level. And yet what they want to do is contribute to that now by making the school system even harder for these kids to access, without really considering what are we getting wrong in the school system that is contributing to this happening. They're just, they're not asked, they haven't asked the right questions from my perspective.
So I tend to agree. So moving on to the next sort of topic, Eleanor in her overview talked about accountability. One of the big things that we were campaigning on through the Save Our Children's Rights campaign, through the various campaigning, was protect our children's legal rights. From someone who has no legal background, one thing that I noticed was they have found a sort of a backdoor into being able to remove children's legal rights. There is no accountability. So who is accountable, and what do we do about that? What happens if I don't agree with a decision? Eleanor, if I come to you first from a legal stance, what happens if I don't agree with their decision to not, if I kind of mix Sam and yourself here, if we say Sam's child, that's it, we're not getting an EHCP because we don't sort of hit these markers that we've agreed, what can someone like Sam do?
Well, you will still have the right to appeal to the tribunal. And so far as we can tell from fairly recent stuff that's come out of the DFE, they are still using what sounds in theory like the same definition of provision requiring an EHCP, i.e. provision that's not available within normal mainstream resources. The difference, I think, is clearly going to be in what they claim is available through more normal mainstream resources. And they will be saying that because we have put all these extra resources into the mainstream and they've got their spiffy unit, inclusion base, and access to experts and so on, that you don't need an EHCP, and also potentially, I suppose, that your child doesn't fit into one of those 7 boxes. So it is slightly up in the air as to what you would have to prove to get an EHCP, but it's I think, going to be a higher hill to climb just to satisfy everybody that it's not available as part of the universal offer or targeted support.
So, okay, so there's some routes, but limited. Sam?
So in the white paper, Eleanor, they say there's going to be no changes to the support received to EHCPs before at least September 2030, as children reach the end of a phase of education. It's then going on to say those who do not need an EHCP will be supported through the flexible layers, which can be accessed from day one. Does this mean that they could really then go to the bottom rung of the ladder? It doesn't necessarily mean they'll get targeted plus, does it? But they
Not
have to start
not inevitably.
at the beginning.
In fact, that just put an interesting thought into my head, actually.
Yeah.
Because they say they're going to start putting the funding and the training and so on in place before September. And are we going to see people arguing that, well, the provision in schools is so much better now anyway, that you don't need an EHCP even before 2030? It's only just popped into my head, and I don't want to start ringing alarm bells about it. But they will be effectively saying, well, yes, you needed support under the old system, but now it's so much better that actually your child's going to be okay on one of the other 3 levels. And it won't necessarily be just going back to targeted plus. It could go back further, potentially. Proof's going to be in the pudding, I suppose.
Eleanor, that point was raised in one of the Chambers webinars that I went to, which was that whilst the law doesn't change, actually the thresholds for may need a plan is necessary, are going to change as what is deemed ordinary available becomes higher. So I think that is points that other people have put forward there as well, other legal people.
Yeah.
So
but the biggie, I don't know if you want to deal with it now, will be the fact that you have less chance to go to the tribunal, for example, because you can go after every annual review potentially. And it looks like there will only be a change of placement, a change of phase times. I assume that you would have a right to appeal against an amendment. So if, say, there's a crisis, a placement falls apart and the EHCP has to be amended, I would hope you would have a right to go back to the tribunal after that, but it's not certain. The biggie is this thing about not effectively having a right to appeal in terms of schools. You do have a right to appeal, but the most the tribunal can do is say, well, the tribunal's decision was unreasonable, go away and think again. And I don't really like that terminology about reasonable. You could have a reasonable decision that's actually completely wrong for this child. The decision was made 6 months ago. They've had a complete crisis since then. It was possibly reasonable at the time it was taken. It's no longer reasonable. It's so chaotic, and if the tribunal says it was an unreasonable decision, the local authority goes away and says, no, we thought about it carefully, and yeah, that school's the only possibility. You're back where you were, and you will then potentially have to take it to court, presumably, which is complicated to say the least, and expensive.
Yeah. Annie?
Yeah, I guess my level of worry is around the removal of rights to appeal to the tribunal, and therefore being in the complaints process with schools. Eleanor, I'd be interested to hear how you feel about that, because I know that you're a school governor,
Yeah.
and that the presumably the level of complaints within schools is going to increase massively, and what impact that's going to have not only on the schools themselves, but in terms of the time that it's going to take them to investigate complaints, but also on governors who are going to clearly be part of that complaints process.
That's sort of one of my soapboxes. I think in some schools are saying that they already have an increased level of complaints, and that it is one of the most stressful things that head teachers have to deal with. And inevitably it'll go up. At the moment, if a child's not getting the support that's set out in the EHCP, a school is entitled to say, well, the local authority has not funded it, and we will help you go and nag the local authority. But it will be firmly on the school's doorstep. And the whole stretch of decisions from, do they go on to targeted? Are they going on to targeted plus? What's in the ISP? Are they going into the unit? If not, why not? All of that will go to schools. And as I mentioned, mostly it's school governors panels at the moment. School governors are volunteers. They are not trained unless they choose to be in SEN. When currently you have a trained tribunal with experts on it, these will not be experts. And it's quite a hard job being a governor. There's a lot of responsibilities already laid on them. I question really how many will be volunteering for these panels and whether it'll be possible to put them together. And especially when you bear in mind that if the parent doesn't agree with the outcome of the panel, the next step is liable to be that disability discrimination action or judicial review. And the person who has to defend that decision will be the governors. It'll be their decision that is being challenged. And I have to say, as a school governor, I don't want to get into that. I'm possibly more likely to feel comfortable with the SEN side than most. So, to the best of my knowledge, I don't believe that there's been consultation with governors, and I really don't think they want to know, to be honest.
I think for me, what concerns me largely, and I've seen a couple of comments as well, largely what this looks like is it means that parents are going to have to become a lot more adversarial with their schools, not because they want to, but because they've got no other option than to do so. And this is a school that they are then hoping will continue to support their child after all of that, which causes a lot of concern. And for me, what I understood of the white paper is it feels to me that the whole idea of this is actually they've removed the accountability from local authorities, placed so much of it onto the schools themselves and said, we've given you a ton of money. You can now deal with this yourself. And it puts all of the problem back on the schools, which is going to damage so many relationships, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, being in legal proceedings is absolutely toxic. And anyone who's been through disability discrimination will tell you that that's pretty nasty as well,
Yeah.
usually. So that's not good for the relationship. And it's all very well, sort of people like me having a nice fight about it, but you as the parent and the child have to
Mm.
carry on dealing
And
with that school. And um, sorry, there
am
was
I
something
right
else
in
that popped up in
thinking?
my head. I'll come back to it.
Am I right in thinking as well that for me as a parent, I can raise a disability discrimination claim for either free or very little funds, but for a school, they're going to have to fund the defence of that.
Yeah, assuming
Right.
they're
And
legally represented. Yes.
they will have insurance that will cover that. However, if we're going to see an overuse of that, one can only assume that that will mean that insurance premiums will rise exponentially, because
Yeah.
insurance companies aren't going to, charge the same fees and yet suddenly be involved in significantly more legal proceedings. And presumably in those fields, there will need more solicitors working within that as well, because there won't be as many at the moment. And I don't know about the others, but when I kind of support parents, the use of muttering about disability discrimination to a school is always the nuclear option. It's something I don't do very often, and tend to only do when the relationship with the school has broken down so irrevocably that actually it's not going to necessarily make it any worse, because it does change things. The schools kind of shut down, they close it, it frightens them because they don't understand what this means for them. They're going, well out of their area of expertise. And in lots of the things I've attended about this, I think this is one of the big concerns, is the changing in the relationship between parents and the school. And like Eleanor, I'm also a governor, and we've seen in Schools Week about already the exponential growth of complaints to schools, and the use of AI by parents in writing those letters. But we all know that AI, it does lie, it does make stuff up. I have first-hand experience of it. It makes up case law, it makes up all sorts of things. And so schools are having to actually spend quite a lot of time unpicking complaints to work out what's law and what isn't.
Mm.
I don't see, head teachers need to run their school. They don't have the experience in this, and they're going to be spending an awful lot more time doing this, and it's going to be quite unpleasant.
It's going to take the professionals away from the actual work that they should be doing and
Yeah.
bog them down. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And
Annie?
governors.
Yeah.
Just around sort of ways in which parents can dispute decisions. I'm passing it back to Eleanor again, really, but around judicial review and decisions made by, you were talking about decisions made by governors, are that the governors are then going to have to represent why they've made those decisions to courts if judicial reviews are bought. Do you think that judicial review is going to become one of the main options of dispute in terms of parents having to go through the complaints process and actually bringing it to a court system to make those decisions? Do you see a massive rise in judicial review because of that?
Well,
Can I add a sub question to that, Eleanor, before you
yeah.
answer, so that you can answer it? And do you see a point where governors and potentially head teachers are going to have to get legal advice before they do make certain decisions in order to kind of protect themselves down the line?
Well, yes, I think they probably will in many cases. They have to be more aware of that. I think there will be an increase in judicial review. The question mark is around funding. I mean, at the moment, it is relatively easy to force a local authority to comply with many of the education duties because they are duties owed to a child. Therefore, you can get legal aid in the child's name. We're slightly in unknown territory when it comes to challenging a complaints panel. I would hope that you could still argue that because it relates to a child's rights, it could be an action in the child's name. But I can see people on the other side of the fence raising a big argument that the right to complain is a parent's right, and therefore eligibility for legal aid should go on the parents' means, which will, if that succeeds, legal aid will be much less available. And that's significant not only because the cost of bringing judicial review proceedings is quite high, but if you lose, you're potentially looking at paying the other side's costs. But it could happen. So I'm afraid it's a slight wait and see on that. I would hope, partly for just public policy reasons, the courts would, and the Legal Aid Board would continue to expect that you're looking at children's rights, but we'll have to see. The other point I did just want to raise, because in all fairness, Department for Education would raise it, is that I've heard certainly Georgia Gould say with great passion that the other accountability thing is Ofsted, and that's significant in people's mind what Ofsted says, etc., which is possibly right. And Ofsted does now have this remit to look at equality. The problem is, that if your child has not got the right ISP or is not getting what's in their ISP, it's not a whole lot of comfort to you to know that Ofsted might come in and slap their wrists in 2 years' time. It's just not effective. So it's just not. I think the big issue around accountability really is that the Department for Education has a different interpretation of what it means to everybody else.
Yeah.
And it's certainly what Save Our Children's Rights are saying is that actually you don't really need to change the law much, because much of what's the problems with the current law they arise because local authorities regularly and very cynically do not comply with the law, and it's difficult for parents to enforce it. But quick amendments put in an effective accountability mechanism that doesn't involve going to court, that parents can access easily, would solve so many problems.
Yeah. Thank you. Megan, your final comment on this, because we're running close on time.
Well, I think it's important to realise that with EHCPs, you will still have an ISP, and that's where the day-to-day provision. So I think what we currently think of as Section F of an EHCP actually will be in the ISP moving forward. The EHCP is not going to go into that level of detail. But it made me think, as you were talking there, Eleanor, in terms of obviously the route to whether or not, where you're happy with what's in the ISP would presumably be, again, it's going to be the complaints process. And what we don't know is what the legislation is going to say around what goes into the ISP, and therefore where the duties lie, and whether this is, again, whether or not that would be open to legal aid for JR, because it's a direct duty to the child, and therefore you could get legal aid in the child's name. So I think there's all sorts of things that, again, until we see the legislation, perhaps we don't know.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to pose two questions here to the panel, and would like to get your thoughts. They're largely about the narrative that I'm seeing out there in the world at the moment. The first narrative that I'm seeing, and again, I'm commenting here on narrative that I'm seeing, not my own personal views. But one narrative that I'm seeing is that an awful lot of people are saying that there seems to have been this spike in SEND needs, particularly in neurodivergence. There are so many more people that have neurodivergence, and we've heard horrific comments like, is there something in the water? Is it just people making it up? Is it laziness? Like all of these horrific comments that are being made. We are seeing an increase in requests for EHCPs. We are seeing an increase in those diagnosed or looking for diagnosis. What's your sort of response to that narrative out there that it's something in the water, or it doesn't really exist, or anything like that? So any comments on that? So Megan first.
promise not to bang on too much, and you are allowed to shut me up if I do. I think the devil is in the headlines, and therefore in the detail. When we talk about an increase in diagnoses, it's important to look at where that is happening. So yes, there is an increase in adult diagnoses, and I am one of those numbers. But actually, if we look at prevalence rates across the world, they have remained pretty stable in terms of autism and ADHD. And where we're seeing an increase in diagnosis is in older populations that actually probably would have been diagnosed earlier had there been the understanding of the situation. Where we see an increase in autism diagnoses as well, we've got to remember that 2015 we saw a change in how some of these conditions were identified within the DSM, moving from the DSM-4, which separated out into autism, Asperger's, the wonderfully named PDD-NOS, and a couple of others, and that's all been kind of brought in under the umbrella of the autistic spectrum condition. So yes, we might have seen a rise in the autism diagnoses, but that's partly because all of those other diagnoses have gone, and so they've been brought. So the overall number is largely the same. Prevalence haven't gone up internationally, and they are sort of very similar across the different countries as well. So in terms of, if you're looking at it from a statistical data perspective, the headlines misinterpret that. I shall step off my soapbox.
No, thank you. Annie?
There's also the rise in social media. Spread of information is so much easier now. So people are becoming more informed more quickly, and the general understanding and research around all of these conditions has increased massively. But in addition to that, schools have changed so much. The environment in schools have changed, whereas perhaps when I was at school, the environment at school was quite different to the environments at school now. And these schools with thousands of children in them and all of that type of thing, the noise, just the sensory environment, all of that is so different now to how it was before. So it's not just that there are there's more children in need of additional support, not just because there might be some additional diagnosing going on, but that's only because that people are becoming more aware, and the environments that those children are being put into are that much more difficult. So I think it's a twofold thing.
Honey, I think this as well about the increase in EHCPs and the increase in things like AOTUS. You know, pre-2014, the internet and social media in its current form didn't really exist, and so the sharing of information was so much slower, so much more limited. And actually, some parents are I do think a particularly savvy group of people. Those of us that kind of fight, you know. I'm a history teacher, but I've read the SEN Code of Practice. I've read the Children and Families. I go away and read law now, and go right to the kind of point. I've taught myself under the tuition of Eleanor, most definitely. That's not going to go away. The way that we share information isn't going to go away. The self-education of this group of people and the self-advocacy of this group of people is not going to go away. And I think that's played a huge part in things like the rise in tribunal rates, in the rise in requests for EHCPs. And that's not going to disappear.
Mm.
No, in fact, it's probably going to increase further because not only organisations like our own, but there are lots of other organisations. People are getting online. They're talking about all of these conditions so much more. They're talking about the law, and as you say, you get a neurodivergent parent, even if their expertise is somewhere completely different. Eventually, they will become experts in their area of interest because that's the way in which it works.
And our reach as a charity has changed post-COVID with our ability to go online and webinars and online advice centres. So we have been able to reach out to areas, whereas previously it was limited, it was really focused on where we had drop-in, advice centres. So again, we've been able to spread the word so much more there.
Yeah.
The next question on narrative, again, I've seen a narrative coming through that part of the problem is the privileged middle class people are able to buy the rights and sort of by provisions and removing the rights of those that need it the most. Again, these are not my views. These are just things that I'm seeing. I'm definitely seeing there's a narrative there coming out that middle class parents and families are the ones that are thwarting this system for so many. I just wondered what you would say to that. So, any quick off the draw there?
Well, I think that we've probably answered that question almost within the other one. It is the fact that there is this spread of information, and I appreciate that there is this sort of general idea that it's middle class families that have got the money and ability to be able to fight these things. But actually, what we find as a charity is that a lot of the people that reach out to us are not those people at all. And it is people who are willing to dive into the detail and fight against the system in terms of, you know, being able to access information. So we have families from all kind of all classes. I mean, I don't want to say classes, but you know, you get people from all sorts of backgrounds being able to access information that potentially they would never have been able to access before. So it seems like a sort of something that I don't think that they could back up in terms of actual numbers.
There is no doubt though that, you know, if you're not literate, if you don't have easy access to you know, those accessing the internet on their phone, for example, a lot of this stuff becomes more difficult. But I don't think any of these reforms are going to change that, because actually we're going to have to up our education. We're all going to need to understand the Equality Act in a lot more detail, the Disability Discrimination Tribunal in a lot more detail. We're then going to have to disseminate that out to everybody else, and do things like this. And so those that still have barriers to accessing the system, to understanding the complaints processes and all that, the barriers are still going to exist, and we're still going to need to find them and help and support them.
Eleanor?
Well, yeah, I think there's a point to be made that yes, if you can, whether it's through legal aid or because you have the money, afford people like lawyers to help you and experts to give the right advice, that will help your chances of success in an appeal. That doesn't mean that your child is getting something they shouldn't have. It's still, you still have to work very, very hard to convince a local authority or a tribunal that they actually need the support that you are asking for. And you know, it's sure there's an advantage just because it makes your life easier. But as I say, it doesn't mean that it's being taken away from other children. The other thing really is just look at the statistics. If you look at tribunal appeals, something like 99% of parents win. In fairness, I would point out that if it's a contents appeal and a school appeal, that's not necessarily a complete win, because the tribunal counts something as a win if you've just managed to get a few sentences changed. And if a parent wanted, say, to change the school and hasn't succeeded, they won't regard that as a win. But nevertheless, even taking that into account, the success rate is well over 85%. And the majority of people who go to the tribunal are not represented. So, you know, those are not sharp-elbowed, well-off middle-class people getting their lawyers in, winning those appeals. It is everybody, including, as I say, a very large proportion of people with no representation at all. And we certainly see that in terms of the people we help who regularly succeed in achieving what they want through the tribunal.
Thank you. And Sam?
Eleanor's just covered most of it, but I would just like to touch on something Megan covered before about parents struggling to access information if they're using phones and things like that. The ISPs that they're proposing are going to be fully digitalised, and that does raise concerns for me that some parents won't actually be able to easily access this information. They won't have computers, they won't be able to find out the information contained within the ISP. And a lot of the families we support are in those situations. They don't have the internet, for example. and it does raise questions.
And if you've got to go onto a portal and then drop down menus and all of that,
Yeah.
that from the phone becomes really, really difficult. It's a really valid point, Sam. I'm conscious of the time, Richard, and there's been a question at the end which reminded me of, about sort of someone saying that they were struggling with the questions on the white paper. And I know we had some really important points, helpful for Annie particularly, really helped me with this.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I give the sort of the summary to lead us into this, what I'd like to hear from you all is, I know that for many of us, as soon as you got the white paper released, the first thing you would have done is you would have looked at the timescales. How does this affect me? And for many, because of the timescales, it looks like there will be a number of children that this won't necessarily affect. I'd still like to ask the panel why it should still matter, and why people should still do something about it, and then what can you do about it? And that hopefully, Megan, will lead into the question of the consultation is really quite quite overly complicated and looks like it's not easy to access. So yes, you're absolutely right. We talked about ways that you can actually respond to that. So yeah, to the panel, what's your views on that?
Well, just to start it off, I would say that please, everybody respond in some form, even if you've done your calculations and you've breathed a sigh of relief and your child won't be affected. You know, there's so many children it will affect. You have to sort of think about possibly your younger children, your grandchildren, your friends' children, your nieces and nephews. And, you know, just actually for society as a whole, it's in everyone's interests for children with SEN to receive the right support in school, just because so many otherwise end up being excluded, and in the crime statistics, and you know, on benefits, and it makes no sense. We need to get this right, but you know that in terms of the consultation, I think the big problem with it is that they have asked the wrong questions. They'll say something like, "Can we? How do we do this better?" without saying, "Should we do this at all?" So I think, was it Megan? Someone taking a fairly robust approach and simply answered the questions they thought they should have done.
Annie's got a great.
Yeah.
So yeah, Annie, what was your technique here with the wonderful questions that they've asked that are leading you to answer the way that they'd like you to answer?
I just ignored them. So I wrote myself just a Word document of all of the points that I wanted to make. So I put it all into a Word document so that I could just think about it in my own time, in my own way. And I thought about all of the things that were concerning to me, or the thing, and I looked through some of the questions, but the questions are all very sort of positively worded. They're looking for you to tell them how you think that inclusion bases are going to work, or something along those lines. It didn't make any difference to me. The thing that meant a lot to me was that actually I didn't want the law to change in such a, you know, in any way really. I certainly don't want children to lose their legal rights. So I wrote all of that down into a Word document, and then I quite literally, instead of answering their questions, I copied and pasted what I'd said into that document. And there were some word limits, so I had to copy and paste it into several questions, but also none of the questions are compulsory. So if you copy and paste it into 3 or 4 questions and then submit it, then all of what you have had to say is sent to them, whether it's answered the question that they've posed or not. And I think that the questions can be quite complex and sort of lead you off in a different direction. If what you want to say is that you don't want your child's legal rights to change, then say that and don't worry about answering their questions.
I think that's the thing. I think for me, particularly as an autistic person, forms I find I'm an intelligent person, but forms I find really difficult because they ask these very specific questions and I'm like, I've got to answer the question. And I think Annie's advice there, which gave me permission, because I'd said to you guys yesterday, I'm overwhelmed with the thought of filling out this, and at the moment I'm completely ignoring the fact that it's there. Annie has effectively gave me permission just to completely ignore the questions. So the only question about AP is, what do you think the right maximum length of time for a temporary placement in AP is? I now have permission to completely ignore that, to not even try and fit everything I want to say about EOTAS and AP into that question, which is how I might have done it, but to just write my blurb and, as Annie says, copy and paste it into the first however many questions it takes to fill it. So I think that's what we're giving you permission to do. Say what you think, just ignore the questions.
I haven't actually really looked at this properly myself, but in the past it's certainly been possible just to put see attached document and have a separate document. I'm not sure whether the system allows for that, but if so, oh yes, someone's just pointed out you can email them, so you could simply actually ignore the questionnaire completely, and send your own document with your own thoughts as an attachment to an email.
Does that run the risk when they're reporting back on numbers of people that have replied to the consultation? Does that run the risk of them kind of saying, well, only X number have replied, because they'll just take the consultation, the actual consultation? I know I sound
I don't
cynical.
know.
Yeah,
I'm not
think it
sure.
may.
Yeah,
think it
I
may.
largely
Well,
suspect that if they get an email that they don't like, they'll choose not to count it in their figures. That would certainly be my cynical
Well, you could just get
approach.
around it by going X number of people replied to the survey, which is different. I don't know. I just,
Yeah.
Or maybe
Um,
just do both, like copy and paste it
Yeah.
into the consultation and then ping it off on an email as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
Or
And
even just say, I've
organisations
emailed
like
you.
ours will be putting in quite detailed responses to every question, even if it is to say you have asked the wrong question here. But I think it's important not to leave it to other people, because they love their numbers. And if you were saying, and if they can say, oh well, we only got 100 replies, so everyone must be happy with it. That's what they'll be saying. So if they actually get thousands of responses, the vast majority saying, telling them what's wrong with it, acknowledging that some things are right, that's more difficult to ignore.
The other thing alongside that is to go to your MPs as well. And I think,
Yes.
MPs, we have seen that they massively went against the government with the DWP reforms. Early responses to the white paper, I think they felt assured by what they were seeing. But I think that's beginning to change. And we've got to remember that so many MPs in place are new MPs. So actually, they are open to supportive education, as in from us to them on these matters. So I think absolutely, start talking to your MP, start engaging with them, make them realise why these things aren't working, point out some of the anomalies that we've discussed today. Why actually are we not really keeping the SEN Tribunal? Why are we not actually keeping EHCPs apart from a name only? And perhaps unpick some of the messaging that the DfE are putting forward on this, which is not really portraying the reforms for what they really are.
Thank you all. I'm aware that this is a topic that, given more time, we could probably double the amount of time and still not cover all of the topics. I know that's there's still going to be a number of questions that people will have. If we haven't got round to answering your questions, you will be able to reach out to us. Annie has put an email address that you can contact us on. Sam?
So I just wanted to flag that the consultation closes on the 14th of May. So that's really important for you to all be aware of. We will put links on the consultation questions, and please share with family and friends. And even if you just answer the first question, please answer. Just give your views. It's really important.
Thank you. Yes.
And
Megan?
Eleanor, you could probably talk to this better than I, but they will Save Our Children's Rights are looking to hold a demonstration as well, aren't they?
Yes, they are. And I'm not quite well. We've still got to go through processes, because you have to get permissions and so on. But I think it is looking like the 11th of May, but don't hold me to that. But please keep an eye on their posts on Facebook and elsewhere.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you all for coming along and joining us for this conversation. I hope that it's been helpful to you, and I hope that we've gone towards answering those questions that we can. Obviously, there are so many sort of question marks over so many aspects of this. So we knew going into this that we wouldn't be able to answer all of those questions. We can just give our views on what our sort of understanding is. But I'd like to thank the panel as well for giving up the time to sort of review the documents, go through it with a fine-tooth comb, and be able to sort of help us get a better understanding of this. So thanks so much. Thank you all for attending, and the recording and the slides will be made available. Just reach out to admin@sossen.org.uk. But thank you all for attending, and I hope you have a lovely day.